What if I told you that the book of Acts isn't a neutral historical record, but a carefully crafted narrative designed to promote a unified version of Christianity? Acts tells the story of how the early church grew from a small Jewish movement to a worldwide faith. But beneath the surface, we find contradictions, omissions, and clear theological agendas. Is Acts reliable history, or is it a theological retelling meant to smooth over the messy reality of early Christianity? In today's New Testament for Skeptics video, we'll look at the book of Acts and uncover the truth behind this so-called history. First, let's discuss the author of the book of Acts. Acts is traditionally attributed to Luke, the companion of Paul, the same person who is said to have written the Gospel of Luke. But just like the Gospels, Acts is anonymous, and its authorship is highly debated for several key reasons. First, the we passages. Acts uses the first-person pronoun we for multiple sections in Acts, which suggests that this writing is an eyewitness account. But some scholars argue this could just be a literary device rather than proof of authorship. We also need to consider the writing style. Acts is written in sophisticated Greek, indicating a highly educated author, not necessarily a traveling companion of Paul. It's easy to say that Luke was an educated physician, but there's simply no evidence that it was Luke who actually wrote this book. Lastly, we need to look at the date of composition. You see, most scholars place Acts between 80 and 100 CE. This was decades after Paul's death, meaning the author likely wasn't present for the events that he describes. So if the author of Luke wasn't an eyewitness, how accurate can Acts really be? Let's move forward to the theological agenda. One of the most striking things about Acts is how smooth and organized the growth of Christianity appears. But this sanitized version of events does not match what we see in Paul's own letters. Here are a few examples. First, Acts portrays Christianity as a unified movement. But in reality, Paul's letters reveal deep conflicts between Jewish and Gentile believers. Let's take a look at Galatians chapter 2, 11 through 14. Paul says, "But when Peter was come to Antioch, I withstood him to the face, because he was to be blamed. For before that, certain came from James. He did eat with the Gentiles, but when they were come, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing them which were of the circumcision. And the other Jews dissembled likewise with him, insomuch that Barnabas also was carried away with their dissimulation. But when I saw that they walked not uprightly according to the truth of the gospel, I said unto Peter before them all, If thou, being a Jew, livest after the manner of Gentiles, and not as the Jews, why compellest thou the Gentiles to live as do the Jews?" This doesn't look like a unified religion. They had major differences in their theological beliefs. Paul openly criticizes both Peter and James here. But the book of Acts downplays the tensions between Paul and the Jerusalem apostles, even making it seem like Paul and Peter were allies. But it doesn't appear that this was really the case from Paul's writings. Again, it's important to note that Paul's writings are at least 30 years earlier than this account being written in Acts. So this suggests that Acts was written to change Paul's narrative and to promote an idealized, unified church, rather than to document history of what really happened. Now, I want to take a moment to shift our attention to the contradictions that we find in the book of Acts. Since Acts focuses heavily on Paul's missionary work, we can compare its version of events with Paul's own writings. And no surprise, we find several major contradictions. Number one is Paul's conversion. Acts tells the story of Paul's conversion 3 times, but each version has different details. You'll remember the story of how Jesus appears to Paul traveling on the road to Damascus, and he says, "Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me?" Well, in Acts chapter 9, Paul's companions hear the voice, but they see nothing. That's how the story is recorded. But then in Acts 22, it's somehow the opposite. In this account, they see the light, but they don't hear the voice. And finally, again in Acts 26, Paul says the voice he heard spoke to him in Hebrew, which is absent in the other accounts. We have to ask the question here. If this was a real historical event, why does the story change? And why would it change in the same book of the Bible, written by the same author? It really doesn't make a lot of sense. Second, we can look at Paul's relationship with the Jerusalem church. In Acts 9, 26 through 30, Paul goes to Jerusalem immediately after his conversion. But in Galatians chapter 1, which again was written by Paul 30 to 50 years earlier, Paul says that he deliberately avoided Jerusalem for 3 years. So which version is correct? It appears that Acts rewrites history to make Paul and the Jerusalem apostles appear more aligned than Paul says that they actually were. Third, we're going to take a look at the Council of Jerusalem, found in Acts 15 and Paul's account in Galatians 2. Acts 15 presents the Jerusalem Council as a harmonious meeting where the apostles agree that Gentiles don't need to follow the Jewish law. But in Galatians 2, as we read, Paul described a heated confrontation where he argued against Peter and against James. Again, Acts makes it seem like everyone got along, but there's a motive here. Its goal is to present a unified version of Christianity. These contradictions continue to suggest that Acts rewrote Paul's story to fit its own theological agenda. It simply can't be viewed as history. Another major theme in Acts is how sympathetic the Roman officials are to Christianity. We previously saw in Luke 23 verse 4 that Pontius Pilate is reluctant to crucify Jesus. Then we see multiple scenarios of Roman governors actually defending Paul. We see this in Acts 18 and again in Acts 25. And Paul famously appeals to Caesar and is treated fairly by the Roman authorities. Now this makes for an interesting storyline, but this is very different from what we know about how Rome persecuted early Christians. Why does Acts portray Rome in a favorable light? Well, one theory is that Acts was written to appeal to Roman authorities, showing that Christianity was not a political threat at all. And another possibility is that the author wanted to distance Christianity from the Jewish rebellions, making it seem more acceptable to the Roman Empire. Either way, this suggests that Acts is not an unbiased account. It is a carefully crafted narrative designed to present Christianity in a politically safe way. We can't end our study of the book of Acts without discussing miracles. As we read Acts, we find that miracles play a huge role in spreading Christianity. But the stories become more and more exaggerated and theatrical compared to Jesus' miracles in the Gospels. Let me provide a few examples. The first example is Pentecost, found in Acts chapter 2. The apostles receive the Holy Spirit and suddenly people from different nations can understand them speaking in their own languages. Number two, if we look at Acts 28, we see that Paul survives a deadly snake bite. He's bitten by a viper that should have killed him, but he suffers no harm, and the locals think he's a god. And then third, in Acts chapter 5, we learn that Peter's shadow has the ability to heal the sick. Look in verse 12. And by the hands of the apostles were many signs and wonders wrought among the people. And then down in verse 15, insomuch that they brought forth the sick into the streets and laid them on beds and couches, that at the least the shadow of Peter passing by might overshadow some of them. This is quite the tale. Even Peter's shadow is powerful enough to heal people? If you're thinking that these stories sound a little bit more legendary than historical, you're not alone. This is another example of the author's theological embellishments that are meant to show divine approval for the early church. So in conclusion, when we look skeptically at the book of Acts, we see that it is not a neutral historical account. it is carefully constructed. It's a theological narrative designed to do a few things. Number one, the author wants to show a smooth and divinely guided expansion of Christianity. Second, it downplays the conflicts between the Jewish and the Gentile Christians. And third, it makes Paul and Peter seem like they're allies rather than rivals. And lastly, it portrays Rome as the protector rather than the persecutor of Christians. So rather than preserving objective history, the author of Acts seems to be shaping history to promote a particular theological vision of the early church. The real question is not whether Acts records actual events, but how much of what it claims was rewritten to fit the later Christian agenda. So Acts presents the early church as a unified movement, but Paul's letters tell a very different story. One filled with conflicts and rival theologies, power struggles. So in our next and final video of our New Testament for Skeptics series, we'll examine Paul and the letters that he is supposed to have written. We'll also compare what Paul has to say with what we heard from Jesus, and uncover how early Christianity was anything but unified. We'll see you in the next one.